Chapter 671, Fourth Order Soul Stone. Inside the ice stronghold that Shangguan Bingshui had erected earlier and which contained 60% of her mana as it was the minimum necessary to withstand the aftershocks of an attack comparable to the aftershocks of a nuclear bomb explosion, all those who had fainted before because of the strong shock to their minds after being hit by the explosive sound wave from the first clash between Bai Zemin and Kong Guiying had yet to open their eyes. Although none of them had died, it was clear that at least for the rest of the night they were unlikely to wake up, since in contrast to monsters with high health, all of them had just barely become first-order existences or were in the process of completing their breakthrough quests. But those who were standing, such as Chen He, Nangong Lingxin, Kai Jingyi, Zhongde, Shangguan Bingshui, Sun Ling, Feng Hong, Tinghua, Huang Tian, Liang Jing, Feng Tianwu, and of course, the only mutant beast within the group, Little Snow, as well as 24 more soul evolvers, were waiting for the moment when the chaos that was raging outside the ice stronghold would end for them to finally step out to see who was victorious. If Bai Zemin won, then they could live and continue to create history together, advancing far enough to in the near future become part of the team of founding fathers of the new homeland. If Bai Zemin was defeated, then their lives were over and this was the untimely end of their paths which could have been bright. There was no third option available, because they were too weak for it. It ended. Chen He muttered somewhat uncertainly. It seems so. Kai Jingyi wasn't too sure of her own reply either. It had been about 2 minutes since the terrifying explosions coming from high in the sky, as well as the bright light born from the fierce attacks of two powers beyond the comprehension of most of those present, had completely ceased. Shangguan Bingshui, with a slightly pale face, slowly lowered her arms that were pointing toward the roof of the ice stronghold. The mana inside her body stopped circulating and her mana stopped decreasing as she no longer provided the defensive structure with energy to harden further. Everyone was silent for another minute more before Shangguan Bingshui waved her hand and the ice stronghold began to melt at surprisingly fast speeds considering the enormous amount of ice that had been used to make it. We're heading out. Nangong Lingxin frowned a bit worried. There have been no more explosions and not even the roar of a beast has been heard for a while now. Sun Ling pointed out, trying to act calm. Probably. The battle is already over. After a moment of hesitation, Tinghua asked the question that somehow or another most were asking in their hearts. But, what if we came out only to find that Bai Zemin was defeated? They had all heard Kong Guiying say that he was a fourth-order powerhouse, and they had seen with their own eyes how the seemingly invincible Bai Zemin was beaten like sandbag and sent flying with serious injuries as proof of what the man who came out of the fourth pagoda said were not pure lies. If the enemy were various second-order enemies, the current group would not be afraid to fight, as they now not only had better equipment but had also raised many levels, evolved skills, and were even in possession of the powerful electromagnetic rifles. They would even dare to confront a third-order existence despite not knowing how powerful one was. They believed they had the ability to fight one. However, fourth order? They could not even imagine what an existence of such magnitude could cause with a real strike. Even Bai Zemin, who could smash second-order armies and even annihilate an army of millions of enemies, seemed to not be able to do very much against such an existence. What else could they do then? Didn't Bai Zemin say it? If he loses, then everyone here is dead. Chen He gave Tinghua a sidelong glance and replied with surprising calmness, "You all also saw that barrier surrounding the place. We can't leave the perimeter of the stone square anyway." That's true. Tinghua nodded and sighed while shaking his head. "Forget it, if the worst comes to the worst then let it be so. Who sent us to be weak and unable to decide on our own destinies? I don't think that person did lose." A voice suddenly rang out, attracting everyone's attention. "Tianwu?" Feng Hong looked at his daughter with a hint of surprise in his eyes. Usually, Feng Tianwu did not trust anyone but herself, so it was hard to believe that this same Feng Tianwu seemed to have so much confidence in another living being. Feng Tianwu ignored her father temporarily and said in a clear voice, If team leader had really lose in this battle, then that fourth-order existence would have already come to hunt us down. We all heard when that person said that he only had a few minches left to live, and his purpose, just like the golems from before, is to serve as a trial of these ruins." Hearing the words of Feng Tianwu, the people still standing exchanged glances and everyone noticed that they were no longer as worried as before. At the end of the day, even if they were all willing to fight and die together with Bai Zemin, the fear of death was not something that could be taken away simply by having the resolve to fight. It was the natural reaction of every cell in the body to react with fear of death, a reaction in which the body begged the brain to move away from the danger zone as soon as possible. Shangguan Bingshui looked at Feng Tianwu and her eyes flashed curiously before she turned around and said in an indifferent voice, "You all can wait here if you want to." Huang Tian and the others exchanged glances and all saw the helplessness in each other's eyes. Shangguan Bingshui was the only person present capable of erecting a defense powerful and firm enough to keep them safe from what was happening. If she deactivated the barrier and left, then there was no meaning for them to stay here since they would die anyway if anything happened. After all, none of them could really escape from the square until the trials were over. Shangguan Bingshui waited for no one and was the first to leave the now almost completely melted ice fortress. Behind her, the second to move was Xietain. Xietain knew that even if Bai Zemin won, his already previously wounded body would definitely not be in good condition, and even though she was still not in her best condition either after using healing of the curse 3 times on him, Xietain knew that everyone present needed a supreme powerhouse in order to avoid any danger there might be in this place. Therefore, she gritted her teeth and forced herself to move despite the mental pain still stinging every nerve in her body. Soon, everyone began to move towards the center of the square with slow and careful steps while observing the surroundings with maximum caution. But the more they looked around, the stronger was the disbelief and fear in their hearts. Bai Zemin had already finished paying his respects for Kong Guiying and had also made a vow under the heavens as a witness that someday, in the distant future, the core of the universe would be known by the name of Kong City. Calling the most important reunion point of all in the history of creation under the surname of Kong Guiying and what was once the Kong Kingdom was the way Bai Zemin would show respect, appreciation, and gratitude to King Kong. Even if Kong Guiying had died and Bai Zemin could do nothing about it, at least his name would be remembered for all eternity. I'm sure Brother Kong will definitely be happy, from wherever he is watching, Lilith said softly as she felt Bai Zemin's emotions still somewhat unsteady. Bai Zemin took a deep breath and nodded, I know. Although he wanted nothing more than to lie down to sleep and rest both physically and mentally, there were things to do first. Bai Zemin picked up the small glowing object and fiddled with it in his hand. Despite being only the size of a human fingernail, its beautiful deep blue color was especially striking under the glare of the stars, and even though clearly most of its energy had worn off, that remaining 30 or 40% was big enough that even he couldn't help but feel a little fear at the possibility of all that energy suddenly exploding. It will not happen. Lilith chuckled, not knowing whether to laugh or cry as she understood what Bai Zemin was thinking. Even unclassified soul stones are indestructible and only disappear once the energy inside is somehow consumed. Even I can't break one, let alone a 4th order soul stone. 4th order soul stone. Bai Zemin couldn't help but gasp as the simple but meaningful registration of the small rock in his hands flashed across his retina. Although he already felt it in his heart, seeing it with his own eyes and confirming it with his mind was another thing completely different. This was a 4th order soul stone, for crying out loud. There might even be 4th order existences who had never in their lives seen one, let alone held one in their own hands, but here was Bai Zemin, a 1st order existence who now owned one. Even though it's very worn out, this energy should be equivalent to at least a few hundred or maybe even 1,000 3rd order soul stones. Bai Zemin muttered in astonishment. That soul stone in your hands must be the soul stone that Brother Kong used to seal part of his soul just before he died. Lilith pointed from the side. Considering that the soul stone in your hands has so much energy remaining, we could say that even if no one came to these ruins for at least several million years, that remaining soul thread could have stood the test of time using the energy inside the soul stone. I see. Bai Zemin nodded. The spatial ring glowed slightly and the soul stone was soon stored inside. He turned to look toward the 4th pagoda and realized that it had now undergone a noticeable change. The 4th pagoda had closed and released a faint green glow that in the middle of the night was especially striking. That green glow was absorbed by the magic circle in the square, and although at this moment it should be 8/10 ths lit up with green, it was actually completely glowing. Looking at the central, 5th, and final pagoda, Bai Zemin finally understood what King Kong meant by the 4th pagoda being the final trial and only serving as a key to activate the magic circles of the 5th. So, that's where the real treasure Brother Kong left behind rests. Bai Zemin had to forcefully resist the urge to charge toward the 5th pagoda. He still remembered what Kong Guiying had told him before he left this world forever. Kong Guiying knew how strong Bai Zemin was, therefore, for him to say that unless he completely recovered he should not enter the 5th ruin, since the enemies there were really difficult for even him to deal with. What kind of beings inhabited down there then? Could it be another 4th order existence? Chapter 672. 3 days. Bai Zemin was about to turn around and leave when he suddenly perceived a group of people approaching in his direction. There was no need to ponder the soul power of the other party, as among them was an existence that shined so brightly in comparison to the others that comparing it was like trying to compare the brightness of the moon to the brightness of the stars. Looking back over his shoulder, Bai Zemin's eyes met Shangguan Bingshui's worried eyes. Behind her, Sun Ling and all the others except for a small number who were left protecting the soul evolvers and soldiers who had been knocked out after fainting were looking at him with concern and eyes that were filled with doubt. Bai Zemin said nothing, he merely nodded. However, even though it was just a small gesture that could easily go unnoticed unless one was paying full attention to him, everyone felt as if a giant rock that was balancing on their hearts and could fall and crush them at any moment was suddenly lifted. Thank God. Zhongda sighed in relief and subconsciously took a step back. He had just been reunited with his mother after so many hardships and Zhongda was the only thing she had in this world. Although Zhongda was willing to die for Bai Zemin as he owed him everything, from his current life to his strength and possessions, he naturally did not want to die before securing a good future for his loved one. It's no thanks to God. Nangong Lingxin corrected in a clear and relieved voice. She looked at Bai Zemin with bright eyes and said with unhidden admiration, it is thanks to Bai Zemin. The gods have nothing to do in it. Hearing the words spoken by Nangong Lingxin, everyone fell silent and took a moment to observe the surroundings, trying to imagine in their heads how fierce the previous battle must have been based on the map that surrounded them and the fierce explosions from before. The stone square that could not be damaged even by the attacks of golden golems was so badly battered that it was a miracle that the magic circle was still working properly. Cracks stretched all over the floor and some of them were even as wide as a grown man's arm. The 5 pagodas that seemed indestructible and had been unaffected even with Bai Zemin's attacks, at this point were covered with cracks and it looked like a snort could bring them all down together. In the distance, the trees that stood over 600 meters high could not be seen no matter where they looked and the mountains that rose right at the back of the stone square had been semi-destroyed. They could not even hear the roar of a mutant beast and the pervasive smell of blood still lingered in the vicinity. Was it really caused by the fight between two humans? No one knew who said those words, but everyone knew that they were the words that no one dared to say out loud. When they looked at Bai Zemin now, it was as if they were looking at a completely different person compared to several minutes ago. Before, Bai Zemin was the incarnation of a god who had descended to the human world to save his race from possible annihilation. However, the current him was basically a true god in the eyes of these people. Even Sun Ling couldn't help but look at him in a new light and it would probably take her a few days to be able to talk with him again in a natural way. Sweeping everything tens of kilometers away, destroying mountains, obliterating every sign of life for who knows how many kilometers around. This kind of destructive power was currently in the hands of the person in front of them, a power that only the most powerful and destructive weapon in the history of mankind could reach was being wielded by a 20-year-old man at will. Sun Ling and those who were at the welcoming party 2 or 3 days ago could not help but remember the words Chen he had spoken back then. He had asked Wu Keqian in an honest voice to surrender. Because Bai Zemin was so powerful that his existence was no different from a moving nuclear bomb, a bomb which could be activated depending on his mood. Feng Tianwu looked at Bai Zemin with complicated eyes. That young man whom she had disdained and ignored during her years of youth and immaturity, had now reached a height so high that she not only could not see but also could not comprehend. They could all feel the traces of mana lingering in the hot air, but none of them dared to try to study it. That kind of vicious mana that had resulted from the collision between two monsters could easily turn their bodies into a mass of bloody mist if they made the mistake of absorbing it. Shangguan Bingshui ignored whatever the others might be thinking. In her eyes, there was not a powerful man who had just somehow defeated a fourth-order existence but a valuable and important friend who had just engaged in a deadly battle which could have taken his life if he committed a single slip-up. Your body. She bit her lower lip hard as she realized Bai Zemin's current state and a flash of pain crossed her usually ice-cold and expressionless blue eyes. Among those present, she was the only one who using quantity and purity could barely come close to Bai Zemin's soul power. Therefore, only Shangguan Bingshui could feel how weakened he was at this moment. The current Bai Zemin was so weak that even a first-order existence had no small chance of defeating him in combat. That was how bad his current situation was, and Shangguan Bingshui could see it after several careful glances. Bai Zemin took a step forward to walk toward them at the same time as he opened his mouth to tell Shangguan Bingshui not to worry. However, he was only able to take half a step before he stopped dead in his tracks at the same time as he grimaced slightly, which muffled his words. The veins in his legs that had just healed blew up again and as a result, blood spurted all over the floor as well. In addition, when he stopped abruptly, the veins in his arms that had barely regenerated also exploded and more blood splattered everywhere. The expression of everyone changed abruptly as the smell of blood that was far stronger than the blood in the air filled their nostrils, and as they saw Bai Zemin suddenly turn into a person covered in red liquid, several of them could not help but gasp in shock and fright. Swoosh! Shangguan Bingshui practically teleported next to him and with a worried expression supported his body while whispering in a low voice, "Are you okay? At least, I won't die." Bai Zemin replied before sighing. He smiled bitterly and shook his head as he said in a complicated voice, "The mana and part of Brother Kang's remaining strength is still inside my body relentlessly wreaking havoc. Right now, my mana, health, and stamina stats are working to expel the two malicious energies, but if I move the progress gets stalled. Even if I use blood manipulation the improvement is between 10% and 20% at best of best." "Brother Kang?" Shangguan Bingshui frowned uncomprehendingly. "Kang Guiying, he and I became brothers." Bai Zemin nodded. Seeing the doubt and even disbelief in the eyes of Shangguan Bingshui, he slowly explained, "During the previous battle, when my attack and the one of Brother Kang connected, the Earth's spatial barrier was on the verge of collapse and the entire square along with all of you about to be destroyed. But Brother Kang stopped pushing me at the last second just before the energy born from the power of our two attacks burst out, saving all of you. It is also part of the reason why I emerged victorious this time." Bai Zemin's words were no small surprise to those present. The person who was here to kill them a few minutes ago actually turned out to be the one who saved their lives? They all looked at each other with disbelief on their faces. It was hard for them to accept this kind of truth, let alone when they looked at Bai Zemin's miserable condition. Shangguan Bingshui just shook her head and instead of saying anything, she pointed to the ground in front of her with her left hand. Swoosh! Without difficulty and with astonishing mastery, a semi-transparent stretcher made of ice appeared as a result of Shangguan Bingshui's mana freezing the particles of dust, air, blood, and all sorts of other components floating in the surroundings. Moreover, the stretcher did not seem cold at all as even close up it could be seen that it did not release freezing fog. "I'll help you lie down," she said, and without caring that her beautiful hair was getting stained red, she led Bai Zemin to the stretcher where as carefully as possible she helped him lay down. "A lot has happened today. Besides, in your present condition, there is not much you can do. We'll have to delay the exploration for a couple of days." "Yeah?" Bai Zemin sighed and closed his eyes wearily. "Bingshui, can you sleep in my tent tonight?" Silence reigned in the surroundings for several seconds and several weird glances fell on both of them. "Cough. Leader, I think it's best if you refrain from strenuous physical activities," Tinghua said with some unease in his voice. Bai Zemin opened his eyes, confused. But seeing the way most of them were looking at him, he quickly understood what these people were thinking in their minds. Bai Zemin looked at Shangguan Bingshui and noticed that she looked a little awkward and also a little hesitant, so he quickly added, "I need you to protect me while I am weak. Not only me, but also my sister Meng Qi. The night is when the mutant beasts are most active, and although my short battle against Brother Kang wiped out all the living creatures in the area, we can't exclude that a zombie or any other intelligent creature might come to see what's going on here." All those who were thinking perverted things immediately felt embarrassed upon hearing Bai Zemin's explanation, and Shangguan Bingshui even blushed for a moment before she cleared her throat and said, in a flat voice, "Of course, that's how it is. Even if you didn't tell me, it is what I was going to do. Don't worry." "Yeah, sure. Even she doesn't believe it," Lilith whispered from the side in a voice that only herself and Bai Zemin could hear. Bai Zemin sighed in relief and closed his eyes quietly again, letting Shangguan Bingshui move the stretcher carefully through the air and carry him to the camp. A lot had happened. Bai Zemin was really exhausted and needed a good rest to recover and think with more clarity about what to do next to get out of this miserable situation he was currently in more quickly. On the way, Bai Zemin listened as Shangguan Bingshui and Xietain had a conversation. "Xietain, can you heal Bai Zemin?" "Although yes, I can do it, I would rather wait another 5 hours before I do it." Xietain looked quite fearful as she looked at Bai Zemin's current condition. Why?" Shangguan Bingshui was not happy and immediately frowned upon hearing Xiaoya's reply. "It's because..." Xiaoya explained the pros and cons of her skill healing of the cursed to let Shangguan Bingshui understand that she also had her difficulties. The current Xiaoya did not want to antagonize either Bai Zemin or Shangguan Bingshui, as she actually planned to ally with both of them. If she managed to join them, then she would become a truly frightening existence on the battlefield and her chances of survival would skyrocket through the roof in an instant. Moreover, Xiaoya was certain that once Bai Zemin knew the real use of her skills, he would definitely not be stingy with rewards and merits. "I see." Shangguan Bingshui frowned tightly after hearing Xiaoya's explanation, and even though she was unwilling, she finally nodded. "In that case, in 5 hours come to Bai Zemin's tent. You'll start healing him then?" "Sure." Xiaoya nodded easily and was visibly relieved. She didn't want to suddenly experience 40% of the pain Bai Zemin was currently feeling. Therefore, it was best to wait for her skill healing of the cursed to reset completely so that she could start from the minimum possible and slowly escalate to ensure that her mind did not suffer a shock too big and might even destroy her consciousness depending on the severity. Just like that, 3 days passed. Chapter 673, Before the End. Rumbling the heavens, shaking the earth. Meng-Chi and Xietain, as well as the other soul evolvers and soldiers who had been left in the third pagoda to organize the books, did not come out until after 3 in the morning, but by the time they used the teleportation circle and emerged into the outside world once again, the place they saw was no longer the same as it had been a few hours earlier. The destruction had spread as far as the eyes could reach and the smell of blood was still clearly lingering in the atmosphere. In addition, they occasionally spotted pools of blood that had not yet dried completely as proof that not long ago a big battle had raged in this place. The ruins were very well hidden, so even with the attacks of Baizemen and Kong Guiying shaking the earth, the people in the third ruin did not hear or feel anything at all. Had it not been for the fact that a soldier had been stationed at the entrance of the third pagoda and told them that Baizemen was waiting for Meng-Chi and Xietain in his tent, as well as the fact that no one had died despite the difficulties the group faced, they all might have been too scared to step forward. There was no need to say it, but when Meng-Chi saw Baizemen lying on his temporary bed inside his tent, the girl almost fainted on the spot, and it wasn't until she saw how little but surely he was improving that she finally managed to barely regain her composure. Even then, she refused to move from his side and carefully helped her brother wipe away the beads of sweat that occasionally ran down his face as a result of the overwhelming pain. As for Xietain, she directly broke into tears with a pale face, and no matter what others said to her she didn't seem to be listening to anyone. The pitiful beauty didn't even realize it but actually fell asleep on her knees next to Baizemen's bed with her upper body resting there. And it wasn't only until Shangguan Bingshui prepared a temporary bed for her next to Baizemen's that she finally relaxed a bit. As they had agreed earlier, Xia appeared at Baizemen's tent a few hours later, but her expression became a bit weird when she saw that apart from Shangguan Bingshui, there were more women in the place. Baizemen was asleep, but apart from Shangguan Bingshui sitting by his bedside, there was also Meng-Chi watching over him from the other side, and Xietain was sleeping just a few inches from him. Be that as it may, it was not Xiaoya's business what peculiar relationships the 4 people may or may not have. She woke up Baizemen with the help of Shangguan Bingshui and used healing of the cursed on him 4 times before stopping as she could no longer tolerate the pain. Xiaya really did not understand how Baizemen was not screaming and rolling on the ground at this moment. After those 4 healings, Xiaya left to her own tent and came back 6 hours later to heal Baizemen another 4 times. When she returned 6 hours later, the number increased to 5. The skill healing of the cursed of Xiaya was dangerous and also had drawbacks. However, it was also true that it was more powerful than Kong Lan's skill when it came to helping to recover deep wounds and expel harmful energy from the body. 3 days later, and under the constant care of Xiaya, as well as the 10 daily activations of overlap regeneration, Baizemen stood up, and for the first time in over 72 hours, he saw the sun's radiance again when he stepped out of his tent. He stretched out both arms toward the sky, and the bones in his body made noises similar to thunder rumbling in the sky or a beast announcing its awakening after being sealed for too long. Phew. Back to being me really is good, Baizemen said as he made some circular waist movements to decontract his body. Shangguan Bingshui came out of the tent behind him and couldn't help but laugh when she saw Baizemen's movements. What kind of dance is that? Other than Lilith, Shangguan Bingshui was the only person who had been by Baizemen's side at practically every moment except for a few punctual ones, as Meng-Chi had to continue studying about runes and magic circles while Xietain needed to help keep everything in order together with her mother Sun Ling and the other guild leaders. This dance is meant for mating, Baizemen said with a serious expression on his face. You? Shangguan Bingshui had an expression of not knowing whether to laugh or cry on her face. She shook her head and said with an amused smile, I'm not playing with you. I realize with each passing day that without that skill stone heart you are a natural prankster. I couldn't agree with you more this time. Lilith's voice echoed next to the duo. She even sounded a bit speechless as she said those words. During the 3 days that passed, Baizemen was bored to death, so, naturally, Shangguan Bingshui and Lilith became the targets on which he vented his boredom. No matter the manner, but somehow Baizemen always found ways to tease the two or make them laugh with unanticipated words. Therefore, Shangguan Bingshui was now quite resistant to blushing due to certain words Baizemen would casually say. She also wouldn't get angry if from time to time he told a joke that if someone else told it would probably end up turning into an ice statue. Alright, enough rest. Baizemen stretched his right hand toward the sky and while extending his mana to find his weapon he said in a deep voice, Bingshui, gather everyone above level 25. We are going into the 5th pagoda soon. Okay. Shangguan Bingshui nodded and her sexy body swayed gently. She disappeared in an instant from the place. Swoosh! Crimson Thunder Dragon's last words, which had been on the central part of the square all this time because no one could really move it more than a few steps due to its weight unless people like Zhong De and Huang Tian joined in with powerful active skills, soared through the skies as Bai Zemin's mana seemed to wake it from its eternal slumber, and just like a small animal returning home it fell heavily into Bai Zemin's right hand. Bai Zemin frowned slightly as he looked at the sword in his hands, and when the weapon's records flashed in his eyes, a flash of bitterness accompanied the green letters. Crimson Thunder Dragon's last words, two-handed sword. Rank, 3, physical attack power, 10,000. Options. 1. Weight increases by 50% when it meets resistance and decreases by 50% in the hands of its creator. 2. Releases flashes of lightning with each swing that have the ability to numb the enemy. 3. The creator can use mana to draw Crimson Thunder Dragon's last words towards him. Durability, 2760/9000. Description, a weapon that was forged by a blacksmith that slowly begins to be worthy of being called by that name. The soul and desire of the creator of this greatsword seemed to have the will to destroy everything, and his desire was granted when he used the power of a second-order soul stone belonging to an existence focused purely on physical strength. But what the hell? Bai Zemin was in disbelief as he looked at the durability of his weapon in shock. Even if the fists of a fourth-order existence were strong and tough, they shouldn't be able to decrease the durability of the Crimson Thunder Dragon's last words by almost 7,000 points with just 2 attacks. If that was the case, then there would be no weapons among the lower existences that could be of any use, as they would all be destroyed quickly. The greatsword was not only coated with cracks, but it was also less shiny than before, and the crimson lightning looked a lot weaker compared to the lightning that always danced around the weapon with high power. Curious, Lilith also touched the hilt of the weapon with her small hand, but when the greatsword's records flashed in her ruby eyes, she couldn't help but frown slightly. How strange. She mumbled in confusion. What's going on here? Bai Zemin suddenly frowned and said in a low voice. Could it be? Lilith looked at him in confusion, but Bai Zemin said nothing and instead searched through his latest recently obtained records. He ignored the healings received and activations of other skills, only focusing on his deepest soul records, so it didn't take him long to find what he was looking for. During the past few days, he had spent most of his time resting both physically and mentally, so he didn't even for a moment think about past events. He only focused on recovering as fast as possible using blood manipulation, overlap regeneration, and receiving healing of the cursed from Xietain. Here it is. You have learned 3rd order active skill level 4, Rumbling the Heavens, Shaking the Earth. Rumbling the Heavens, Shaking the Earth, 3rd order active skill, level 4, mass destruction skill with a single target as the main focus. At its peak, this skill has the ability to make the heavens cry and the earth beg for mercy in the face of its power. Activation requires a heavy blunt weapon of great weight and size with more than 5,000 durability points, a flame of 3rd order or higher, 3,000 strength points or more. Effect 1, destroys all life within 100 kilometers around that the user identifies as enemy and whose general stat points are less than 50% compared to those of the user. Effect 2, suppresses by 20% the target enemy's physical attack power during the moment of impact and decreases the physical defense by 30%. Increases the attack power of the weapon wielded by the user by 100% for 6 seconds. Consumes 4,000 durability points 10 seconds after the skill triggers. Bai Zemin's expression was uncertain after reading the records of his skill learned in the middle of combat, but after several seconds it turned bitter and considerably ugly. Great. Another mass destruction skill. He nodded under his lover's confused eyes and said in a growling voice, a skill that my current self can't use at will because I don't have the necessary stats, and that consumes 4,000 durability points of my weapons per use. Cool. Bai Zemin shared the records of the skill Rumbling the Heavens, Shaking the Earth with Lilith, and when she saw it, she finally understood the reason why he said those words a moment ago. That skill is really scary. Mainly due to the fact that in your hands, with your stats, there will come a point where even Lilith stopped midway and changed what she was going to say, but it's really a shame that you can't use this skill now. Besides, that consumption of 4,000 durability points is really insane, taking into account that the durability of your greatsword is considerably high even for some rank 4 gears. Simply put, even if I get a better weapon, I'll only be able to use this skill a couple of times at most. Bai Zemin sighed before thinking aloud, looks like I'll have to use Annihilation of the Falling Sky in that case. Lilith's pupils trembled slightly and a flash of surprise shone in her eyes when she remembered that in Baizemen's possession was an indestructible weapon. It was as if all of the fate aligned perfectly before him, as if the universe itself wanted to reward him for his hardships. Now, even Annihilation of the Falling Sky had great use despite its relatively low attack power, as with it Baizemen could sweep away all his enemies within 100 kilometers. Furthermore, what Lilith did not say before was that at this rate, with rumbling the heavens, shaking the earth, there would come a point where Baizemen could devastate higher existences with a single swing of his weapon. I guess I'll have to do some quick repairs before heading to the 5th pagoda. Baizemen sighed. Baizemen looked for Shangguan Bingshui and told her that before going on the last expedition to these ruins, he would first have to repair his weapon, something she quickly understood and told him not to worry. He thanked her and Sun Ling before heading to one of the ice wagons, the one containing the forging tools. Who would have thought that the first use of these precious tools would be to repair a weapon and not to forge a new one? Chapter 674, Everything in this life is reusable, everything. Baizemen did not even bother setting down the forging tools he had obtained from the second ruin, and instead he just decided to work on the ice wagon that Shangguan Bingshui had created with her skill ice maker. Shangguan Bingshui had become very adept at controlling her skill. Not only was she much more proficient at creating different lifeless things using her ice maker, but she was also able to do it a lot faster and had better control over the temperature of what she created. Therefore, even a normal human would not feel cold when touching the ice wagon, let alone Baizemen, whose physical body had long ago left the level that a human would see as human. The first thing he did was, of course, to put his weapon down on the work table. Then, Baizemen took a couple of minutes to stroke the cracks that covered practically the entire blade of the greatsword as he thought about what to do next. While he decided which option to take, Lilith next to him tried to give him ideas as they casually chatted with each other. Will you forge a new greatsword? With these forging tools you'll surely be able to make something better, won't you? That's without mentioning the good materials you got from that hidden room in the second ruin. To be honest, I'm not so sure. Why? To begin with, forging a greatsword will take me at least several hours. Even if with these tools the process speeds up, the truth is that the better the weapon the more work it takes to create it, so in reality it will still take me several hours. Considering that I want to finish this exploration as soon as possible so I can focus on conquering the rest of China once we solve the personal problems of each of us, and taking into consideration that my Crimson Thunder Dragon's last words has 10,000 physical attack damage, I don't think it is necessary. I don't think it's doable to forge a new weapon. Maybe you're right. Not to mention that even if you forge a new greatsword, you probably won't be able to use it at will if it turns out to be more powerful than your current one. Besides, my current self has no confidence in forging something better than this Crimson Thunder Dragon's last words even with better tools and materials. In fact, this greatsword of yours is really powerful. I still don't understand how you could forge something like this. Rookie's luck, I guess. It's good that you know it. Self-honesty is an important factor after all. In truth, there wasn't much to think about, so after a brief chat with Lilith to clear up all his doubts, Baizemen decided to go for what was relatively simpler and faster compared to forging something completely new and from nothing. Let's repair it, Baizemen announced, walking over to the forging furnace near the work table. He pointed toward the fireplace and said under his breath, "Little Blue, time to get to work." Swoosh! The small deep blue flame shot out from Baizemen's finger and as if greeting him raised its temperature several times before standing still waiting for orders. Good day to you too. Baizemen nodded as he touched the forge furnace and the record slowly flashed in his retina. Volcano Furnace Dash. Special Object. Rank 3. Durability. 30,000/30,000. Options Dash. 1. Keeps the heat of the flames within the limits of the furnace without affecting the temperature of the environment. 2. Reduces mana consumption by 20% when activating a fire-type skill. In the case of possessing a natural spiritual flame, the energy consumption of the flame is reduced by 40%. 3. It becomes easier to control the temperature of the fire. Description: a forge furnace created with the intention to help all blacksmiths who are new at playing with flames. Be thankful, now you won't have to leave with burnt hands, not as much as before. Baizemen ignored the description and nodded in satisfaction before pulling out 2 fragments of lapiodite, the same rank 2 metal with which his greatsword had been forged and the only metal in Baizemen's possession with the ability to double its weight per piece depending on the gravitational force of the world it was born in. You can communicate with your flame now? Lilith raised an eyebrow in surprise at the small interaction between him and the endless lotus blue flame. No, not really. But I think it was waving at me. Baizemen shook his head. Aha. Lilith nodded despite not understanding what he was saying. He had been feeding his flame all this time. Every day he would give it at least 100 unclassified soul stones and a dozen first order. Therefore, while sometimes Xietain was involved in tough battles that ended up draining the endless lotus blue flame's power too much, since the fire was an important part of his total power, the soul power of the endless lotus blue flame had been steadily increasing. At least now, the little blue flame was significantly more lively compared to the past when Xietain formed a soul contract with it for the first time. The first thing Xietain did was damage his greatsword even more. What are you doing? Silence, Lilipedia. Watch and learn. Xietain took a pair of tongs and very carefully ripped off several pieces of the blade. The process would have been especially strenuous had it not been for the fact that the tongs he was using were actually a special rank 3 item, and one of its options was to cut through any metal of rank 3 and below with 60% ease compared to any other tongs. Approximately 10 minutes later, the small cracks that covered the body of the greatsword had disappeared. Instead of the small cracks, 2 huge cracks ran the length of the weapon, one on each side of the blade. Xietain ignored the questioning eyes of the 6th order succubus and with a different pair of tongs meant for the task took one of the 2 lapiodite fragments straight to the forging furnace. Little blue, let's start low and slow. That's it, now turn up the heat a bit. Stop. Good. You just keep burning like that. Just 60 seconds later, Xietain moved the tongs away from the furnace with the red-hot metal and quickly placed it inside a pot, a rank 3 pot with 50% fire resistance, also found inside the second ruin. Then, he took the pot into the furnace and waited 120 seconds before taking it out. All of the lapiodite had turned into a liquid similar to burning lava. Man, it sure must hurt like hell if this stuff gets on your skin. Making rather obvious comments, Xietain covered the edges and the inside of the first large crack of the greatsword with special oil he found inside the second ruin before pouring the metallic liquid into the crack. In just a few seconds, the entire crack was covered with burning lava, and thanks to the effect of the special oil, the temperature soon began to drop, and in less than 5 minutes the crack had disappeared almost without a trace. Now I understand what you want to do. Since covering each small crack would be a headache, you linked each one together to form a larger one so that you would then only need to fill that hole using the same material. Ding dong, you got it right, but no prize for you. Xietain stroked the repaired side with a finger and noticed that even though it was still quite hot, there should be no problem, so he immediately began working with the other side. About 10 minutes later, the greatsword that was on the verge of collapse about 20 to 30 minutes ago had been completely repaired by Xietain. Xietain checked the records of the weapon and nodded in satisfaction. See? It only took me a few minutes to repair it, way easier than forging a new one. Yes, well, it's very good that you repaired your weapon and everything else, but... Lilith pointed to the work table littered with small metal pieces and said, puzzled, what are you going to do with those? Don't tell me you plan to throw them away, do you? Xietain didn't reply right away, and after keeping his greatsword in the storage ring he threw all the small metal fragments into the same pot as before. Then, he took them to the furnace, and after telling the flame to burn at a low temperature he began to narrate a rather peculiar story. Lilith, during my freshman year of college I had as a roommate, a guy who loved the parties. Turns out that guy had once sneaked a girl in from the doorman, and after doing his thing he actually called me on the phone to ask me if I had any rubbers since he had just used the only one he had left. And what did you tell him? Of course, I told him I didn't have any of those. As expected from a full-fledged virgin. Humph, at least I'm not a century-old virgin. I'm not 100 years old. Whatever. It turns out that when I got back to the dorm a few hours later, I asked this guy if he'd managed to find another rubber. But he shook his head and said he didn't. So, this guy sent the girl back to her place? No, they did have sex again, and before you ask, yes they did use a rubber. Don't tell me. Yep. The guy just cleaned the rubber he used before and reused it. Gross. Why are you telling me this kind of stuff? It's for you to understand that in this life, everything is reusable. Xietain ignored Lilith, who was constantly telling him that she would definitely not let him do that kind of disgusting thing in the future no matter what, and worked on the metal pieces that were now red-hot glowing after being overheated for several seconds. He set the pot down on a corner of the work table and with the tongs picked up a fragment. Then, he took the hammer and very carefully began to shape the burning metal fragment in such a way that in just a few moments it acquired a long and incredibly thin shape. Xietain left the first fragment on the table and picked up the second one. After giving it exactly the same shape and thickness of the previous one, he picked up a third fragment and repeated the process. Since he was doing a fairly simple task, for each piece that Xietain hammered, it took him less time to give them the shape he was looking for until it came to a point that he only needed 1 second of time per piece. About 10 minutes later, Xietain wiped away his imaginary sweat and sighed, Phew, that was really laborious. Little brother Xietain, this big sister is worried about her happiness in bed if you can only hammer for a couple of minutes before exhausting yourself. Oh, don't worry about that. Even if I can only hammer for a couple of minutes, moving my fingers isn't as tiring as moving my whole hand. You've really become bold after losing that skill stone heart. Humph. Xietain snorted, and after gathering the more than 1,000 small fragments now more than 5 centimeters long each, but as thin as 2 or 3 hairs together, he took out several first-order soul stones from his storage ring. He laid one hand on the bundle of first-order soul stones and the other on the pile of long metal chopsticks. Xietain closed his eyes and focused entirely on the correct application of the magic smithing process over the objects on the work table. He imagined the assassins throwing weapons he saw in movies when he was younger or read about in some light novels. Long, thin, sharp objects capable of penetrating even the stoutest defense, piercing through even the most valuable armor, and claiming the life of enemies silently with a single sweep. Soon, the multiple first-order soul stones joined together to form a ball of multicolored light, and under Xietan's control, the multicolored light flew toward the pile of chopsticks, surrounding them and penetrating their bodies. Chapter 675, New Challenge, New Weapon. When the multicolored light of the first-order soul stones disappeared, the small, thin metal fragments underwent a slight but noticeable change to the naked eye. Before, except for their thinness and length, there was not much that a person could appreciate. However, when Xietain and Lilith looked at the spikes now, they both noticed that aside from the fact that there were clearly several more compared to before, the body of the spikes had become slightly longer and slightly thicker in the back, but as thin as a hair in the front. So now you're going to start throwing those darts all over the place? Oh, not those darts. These darts aren't the finished product after all. Lilith took a step forward and picked one up at random upon hearing Xietan's words. Her expression became quite weird as she said in a low voice, "These things are 600 physical attack power points, but they're not finished yet. What do you have in mind?" Hee. About that. Xietain took out the small spatial liquid storage pearl and a vessel from inside his storage ring. At his command, a strange blackish-purple colored blood began to flow out from the liquid storage pearl, and as it fell into the vessel and fluttered, the smell of fish immediately filled the air. That's poison? Lilith frowned as she smelled the odor in the air. She couldn't decipher if what was in the vessel was poison or not, as it was too weak for her organism to feel anything, so she could only guess. That's right. Xietain nodded and put the liquid storage pearl away again. This poisonous blood is the product of the fusion of the blood of over 100 unclassified poisonous creatures, 20 first-order, and 2 second-order ones. This thing has so many different types of poisons that mutated after the fusion that now even this daddy doesn't dare to be careless, since even if with my high stats I can suppress most of them, there is the possibility that one will have an effect on me. Of course, I have no intention of checking it at all. After saying those words and without waiting for a reply from Lilith, Xietain put on a pair of rank 1 gloves and grabbed a handful of darts before finally throwing them into the poison-filled vessel. He didn't wait to pull them all out and then repeated the process again with a new handful of darts. Approximately 2 or 3 minutes later, all the darts had been dyed purple-black. At the same time, the rank 1 gloves that Xietain was wearing had to be thrown away, as the mutant beast material that had been used to make it had been corroded to the point that it was not worth trying to use it again on something else. Moments later, Xietain took out another handful of first-order soul stones and began working once again on the magic smithing process. About a minute later, he opened his previously closed eyes, just in time to see the multicolored light disappear after being absorbed by the darts. And to think that 2 months ago you were reluctant to spend even a single first-order soul stone, but look at you now, spending several of them at the same time as if you were eating candy. There will come a day when I'll even use 6th-order soul stones as if I were eating candy. For some reason your words are offensive to me, but I can't understand why. Would you mind enlightening me? Don't worry. It's just your imagination. You, little. Xietain didn't hear what Lilith said next, as he was focused on the darts before him, which had just undergone another change. The color of the darts before was slightly amethyst, as during the semi-fusion process the color of the lapidite had returned to them. However, the color of the darts had currently turned blackish with purple tints, and occasionally a thin amethyst-colored lightning could be seen flickering from the thinnest tip to the thickest part at the back. Xietain was satisfied with the appearance of the darts. After all, while appearance was a secondary thing, wouldn't it be nice if his weapons were all gloomy and majestic looking? With entertained thoughts like that, he picked up the first dart and inspected the records of his new creation. Dart of the Plague Dash, throwing weapon, rank 2, physical attack power, 1200, magical attack power, 999, durability, 500/500. Options dash. 1. Any existence below level 60 has a 100% probability of suffering one of the following status effects: temporary blindness, paralysis for 2 seconds, blood corroding for 5 seconds, corruption for 3 seconds, serenity for 2 seconds. The 100% probability of the effect decreases by 10% for each level the enemy exceeds the indicated limit. 2. Can be repaired automatically when absorbing poison. Description: throwing weapon forged en masse by a novice blacksmith unwilling to miss even the smallest opportunity. Under the bath of several poisons, what were previously fragments of a rank 2 metal turned into deadly weapons for his enemies. Good luck digging them out of the flesh of your enemies. Seriously, what the hell is up with these descriptions? Xietain's expression was quite amused as he read the end of the records. Is that what surprises you, and not the fact that using pieces of a broken weapon you just forged over 1,000 rank 2 weapons with over 1,000 physical attack power and almost 1,000 magic attack power points, as well as the terrifying option to inflict at least a poison among several? Lilith was a bit speechless after seeing the records of the small weapon in her hands. To her, the darts that Xietain had forged naturally was nothing too great. But the reason Lilith was so surprised was because he had created so many rank 2 weapons in just a couple of minutes. Moreover, he had done it with such apparent ease that if she didn't know him, Lilith might have thought that Xietain was secretly a blacksmith who had been practicing for at least a century. Don't overthink it, just call it plot armor. Xietain waved his hand casually and with a single wave stored all the dart of the plague in his spatial storage ring. He was incredibly pleased with the results. He now had another trump card waiting to be used depending on the circumstances. Xietain did not expect that from what was meant to be the repair of his weapon would also end up resulting in the forging of so many good quality throwing weapons. Plot armor? You mean the light novels? Lilith looked at him in confusion. Exactly. Xietain nodded in frustration and grumbled under his breath. I used to browse the forums in the past to discuss theories about my favorite novels back then. But guess what? Most of the time, I would find other readers talking about plot armor for every single event that happened in the story. For the love of God, think a little harder, my friend. There could be so many reasons why a certain event happened, but your little brain only allows you to think of cheap excuses? Bah! If this were a light novel, I wonder how many readers would laugh or how many of them would be upset with your words of dialogue. Fortunately, however, this is not a light novel. Xietain shrugged and jumped down from the ice wagon with a single leap. Come on, Lilith. Time to end this once and for all. Lilith looked up at the bright sky, and for some reason felt that something was wrong, but she couldn't tell where it was wrong. Finally, she looked down into the underground and her ruby eyes glowed strangely as she whispered, shouldn't be a problem considering his actual power. Did you say something? Xietain turned around and looked at her in confusion. No, it's nothing. Lilith shook her head and said with a smile, let's go. After Xietain finished doing what he had to do, he personally gathered the troops that under the organization of Shangguan Bingshui and Sun Ling, who had practically given up her position as second in command for Shangguan Bingshui to take over after witnessing her power and efficiency in giving orders had already been ordered as Xietain had requested earlier. He looked at the faces of the people in front of him carefully. Xietain took more than 5 minutes before finally opening his mouth and saying loudly, all right, everyone. As each of you probably already know, this will be the last ruin and then we can go home. Let's give it all we've got to get it over with as soon as possible so we can get back to having a good night's sleep in our beds next to our loved ones. Bro, I really want to see my wife. It's only been about 5 days since we left base, but it feels like an eternity. A level 27 Soul Evolver smiled as he clenched his sword tightly. Well, we have fought a lot during this time and none of the battles we experienced were easy. Another level 30 Soul Evolver commented, stroking his spear that had several drops of dried blood on it. Ha ha ha. When I return, I'll take it upon myself to challenge that little bitch Xiao Chao to a friendly battle. This old man has now become a first-order existence after so many battles together with Team Leader. Team Leader, open the way please. With you at the helm, do we have anything to fear? Even a fourth-order existence couldn't stop our footsteps. I refuse to believe we have to face anything bigger than that. Ha ha ha. Xietain together with Shangguan Bingshui heard the cheerful voices of everyone present and seeing how each of them looked confident they both subconsciously nodded. Morale is high. Xietain said satisfied. It was to be expected. Shangguan Bingshui chuckled and remarked, even a fourth-order existence could not stop the person leading them. With a capable leader willing to step up before the rest, the troops will naturally be willing to do anything. Xietain nodded silently. He was the type of person who believed that in order for subordinates to perform well, it was first necessary to have someone capable to lead. In chess, the king was the most important but at the same time the weakest piece of all. Therefore, it was not good to leave it alone in the open of the enemy pieces, but it was also not good to leave it in the allied base, as that would mean leaving behind potential powerful attackers who could help bring down the enemy. Therefore, Xietain believed that the best move was to always advance the king together with the subordinates. Bing Shui, did you finish what I asked you to do for me? Xietain said suddenly. Oh, don't worry. Shangguan Bing Shui nodded after realizing what Xietain was talking about. Even though I don't understand why you are being so cautious when the person named Kong Guiying said that he was the final trial, I did what you asked me to do. Although I don't think it will have any use since we will probably take out all the enemies underground. I hope so. Xietain nodded after a moment of silence and continued, but it doesn't hurt to be a little careful and expect the worst. Shangguan Bing Shui shook her head gently. Although in fact, she believed that Xietain was overthinking it, she was also aware that it was precisely that meticulous and pessimistic thinking in expecting the worst of situations in every event that had allowed Xietain to become the outstanding warrior and mage that he was today, as well as the reason why he was still alive. Everyone, move! And just like that, Xietain led his troops directly toward the central pagoda, the last of the 5 pagodas, where the royal treasure was hidden, as well as a new challenge. Chapter 676, the last of the 5 ancient ruins. On the way to the central pagoda, the 5th and last of the 5, Xietain could not help but remember the battle that took place 3 days ago on this site. Even though it was only 2 attacks, even though it was all over in less than 10 minutes, his confrontation against King Kong Guiying was undoubtedly Xietan's toughest battle to date. Even his clash against the First Order Blazing Beetle during his time at the university compound had not come close to taking Xietain to his grave, although it was significantly tighter. The battle between Xietain and Kong Guiying was a battle that literally shook the earth, illuminated the skies, and destroyed mountains. Leaving aside the first attack that nearly turned Xietain into a corpse, the second clash between the 2 men was destructive as few would probably be for years to come. Ironically enough, however, it was also the battle in which Xietain did not have the power to choose whether he wanted to fight it or not, as well as the battle in which he lost someone who unexpectedly ended up becoming important to him. We are here. Shangguan Bing Shui's voice snapped Xietain out of his daze, and as he looked ahead, he realized that at some moment the group had arrived before the 5th pagoda of the 5 silver pagodas. Xietain took a deep breath and nodded before turning around and saying with a serious expression on his face, although in theory the trial is over and at this moment we should be claiming what rightfully belongs to us as victors, it seems that more enemies await us ahead. According to King Kong Guiying, creator of these ruins and previous owner of everything around here, the number of enemies awaiting us in the final ruin is definitely not small. They all listened in silence and with serious expressions on their faces. Although none of them believed that they would lose now that they had overcome so many difficult trials and hardships along the way, it was precisely because they had faced so many difficulties to get this far that they knew that underestimating what they might encounter one step ahead could be the cause of their downfall. During the battle to come, I want the following people to form the second front line in this assault. Shangguan Bing Shui, Qin He, Zhongde, Kai Jingyi, Wu Yijuan, Sun Ling, Huang Tian, Feng Hong, Feng Tianwu, Tinghua, Liang Jing, Nangong Lingxin, Xiaya, Xingyun. Xietain called out the names of over 40 soul evolvers who were above level 40. Among them, there were even mages like Feng Tianwu, Feng Hong, Xingyun, Xiaya, and there were also archers like Qin He and a few more. However, surprisingly, none of the mages or archers who were called to the second front line were scared or incredulous, even though the most rational thing to do would be to station them at the back of the group, just behind the melee fighters with higher defensive capacities by nature. This was because each and every one of them, regardless of whether it was a mage like Feng Tianwu or an archer like Qin He, possessed skills that allowed them to fight enemies at close range or that prevented their enemies from getting too close. There were also others like Qin He himself, who in addition to being proficient with ranged attacks was a great melee fighter and whose stats were high enough above average to allow him to fight against a second-order existence. Seeing the indifferent and confident expressions of all those who had been called out by him, Xietain nodded with a slight smile of satisfaction on his face. These people in front of him, even though they had fought by his side relatively little when compared to the colossally higher number of battles Xietain had fought alongside other soul evolvers and soldiers of his transcendent faction, were all brave warriors worthy of trust on the battlefield. Xietain really hoped that none of them would die in combat, as they would definitely make good brothers and sisters to fight shoulder to shoulder in the future. However, even though he was confident in himself, that same uneasiness he felt on the first day when they went deep into the forest to reach the 5 silver pagodas came back to him. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask before heading into the ruin? Upon entering, I expect everyone to focus 100% on whatever is going to happen in there and forget about anything that doesn't have to do with exploration, combat, and survival. Bai Zemin said, his eyes sweeping over everyone present for the third time. Bai Zemin did not take long to see Feng Tianwu raising her hand gently just like a student during high school waiting for the teacher's permission to speak, so he nodded in her direction. Go ahead. Feng Tianwu lowered her hand and said with a firm expression on her face, even though we all probably already know the answer to this question, but just to be sure, who will be the first front line? Bai Zemin nodded and said in a confident voice, of course, the first front line is composed of me and no one else but me. Feng Tianwu nodded, her expression did not change upon hearing what in her heart she already knew. In fact, everyone nodded as if it was natural after hearing Bai Zemin's words. Any other questions? After several seconds of silence, Bai Zemin took the first step, and just before his body was teleported to the final ruin he said loudly, move! Just like well-trained machines, when the group led by Bai Zemin was teleported after stepping beyond the entry door of the 5th pagoda, all of them immediately took attack or defense positions depending on their role to play in the team while observing the surroundings very carefully. This place was completely different from any of the other 3 ruins Bai Zemin had seen before. The first ruin was a large room with several partitions where there were many pills. The second ruin was a small smithy with tools and materials destined for forging or construction. The third ruin had turned out to be a big library whose books ranged from history to recipes for preparing potions, which detailed even the smallest of details necessary for the preparation to have a good chance of success in the hands of a novice. However, regardless of whether it was the first ruin or the third ruin, both paled to the point of no comparison when they looked at the place they had been teleported to. This place could only be categorized as huge, so much so that wanting to compare the size of this place with the first ruin, which was probably the largest of them all so far, was no different than trying to compare the size of China with the size of Luxembourg. There was simply no scale to compare at all. Above their heads, over 1,000 meters high, were huge boulders that were probably indicative that this place might be hidden somewhere deep underground. Embedded in the rocks on the ceiling were small fist-sized emerald-colored stones that when joined together actually functioned as illumination, which meant that the surroundings were not completely dark. The smell of dampness and earth was definitely predominant, and only a breath was what everyone needed to understand that in this place, there was hardly any fresh air flowing. Besides, what's that smell? It smells just like when I forgot to shower my dog for half a year. Honestly, what is this shitty smell? It seems to be the smell of shit though. More than a few soul evolves began to frown as they went further and further. The situation reached a point that most of them couldn't help but comment and voice their complaints. There was only one path to advance on, straight ahead. The sides were covered by rocks and so was the back, so everyone had no choice but to move forward. However, for every step forward the putrid smell that penetrated their nostrils. This reached such a high level after several minutes that had it not been for the fact that each and every one present had been bathed in the blood and internal organs of their enemies several times, they all might have died vomiting. It really is just as I suspected, Bai Zemin said with a slightly worried expression on his face as he moved forward leading the team a few meters behind him. What is it? Shangguan Bingshui grunted. Her beautiful face was scowling at this moment, and from the flame of anger burning in her blue eyes, she did not seem to be in any way pleased with this place. This smell is the excrement of an animal, Bai Zemin said in a low voice that accompanied the echo of everyone's footsteps. So far, all we have met in the previous ruins were golems created by human hands, which is why we did not get any soul power when we defeated them. However, King Kong warned me of the danger inside this 5th ruin, even though it should be empty after overcoming the final trial of the 4th pagoda. Animal excrement? How much must those animals have defecated for the smell to spread everywhere? This place is huge after all. Zhongde couldn't help but grumble through gritted teeth. Shut up, Zhongde. Nangong Lingxin frowned in a bad mood. No, you shut up, surnamed Nangong. But Zhongde was in no mood to stay silent either, so he also retorted. The two seemed intent on continuing, but when they looked ahead and saw the cold gaze of Bai Zemin who was looking over his shoulder at them, they froze for a moment before closing their mouths and continuing to move forward. Bai Zemin kept his gaze on both of them for a few seconds before turning his eyes forward and continuing his theory. It seems that at some point in the past, some species of animal snuck into these ruins and built their nest here. Now, the number of creatures needed to impregnate this place with this foul smell must definitely be in the millions considering the size of the cave. Millions? Qinhe suddenly opened his eyes in shock and said loudly, "Weaver ant." Hearing Qinhe's gasp, everyone froze. It had been 4 days since they fought against the Weaver ants, but that great war was still fresh in everyone's memory. A war in which, if not for Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bing Shui, the human squad would have been annihilated down to the last man. Weaver ant. Bai Zemin nodded, confirming what everyone feared. Ever since we defeated that army of Weaver ants, I've been wondering why they didn't come back for revenge. After all, it is well known that Weaver ants are vengeful creatures by nature. However, strangely, even after so many days no Weaver ants appeared, and so far not even a single ant at the commander or general level has shown up. They were all either first-order collectors or first-order soldiers. A glint of cold light flashed in Bai Zemin's black as night eyes as he muttered to himself, "Now I finally understand what's going on." Although those last words were not intended for anyone unlike the previous ones, in the silence that reigned inside the cave the words were clear as the water of a flowing river. None of those present were idiots by any means, else they would not have survived for so long unless they had the goddess of luck as their lover. Therefore, it was not at all difficult for them to understand the rest without Bai Zemin explaining any more. "This is great, now the ruins have become the nest of Weaver ants, and as if that wasn't enough, we will have to fight to get what in theory should already be ours." Shangguan Bing Shui shook her head and grumbled under her breath. "Well, Bing Shui, look on the bright side of things," Wu Yijuan suddenly said. "Bright side?" Shangguan Bing Shui looked at her doubtfully. Her mood really was bad as she made sure to say in a voice that only she and Wu Yijuan could hear, "This cave is damp. The wind is not blowing at all. We have millions of enemies to face, among which there will definitely be no shortage of first-order or second-order existences, and there might even be a third-order. Queen, as if what I mentioned just now wasn't enough, we also have to deal with this smell. Where do you see the silver lining in this?" Wu Yijuan smiled sweetly as he looked at her with gentle and kind eyes like those of an angel, causing Shangguan Bing Shui's eyes to shine. But the shine in her eyes only lasted for a second, as Wu Yijuan's next words were not sweet at all. "At least, this is not a spider's nest. Isn't that good?" Chapter 677, Colony of Ants. After walking for around 10 minutes, Bai Zemin could not help but frown slightly as he led the rest. They had been walking for at least 1.5 kilometers at a brisk pace from the point of view of an unevolved human, keeping their guard up at all times, but so far they had not even seen a single ant or any other species of enemy. Had all the ants died? Or maybe there was no one at home? Just as such thoughts were going through his head and Bai Zemin was turning the corner, as all that lay ahead was a wall of stone and earth, his steps stopped dead in their tracks as he found the answer right before his eyes. A green-colored weaver ant was walking calmly in the direction of Bai Zemin's group. Its body was about 1 meter tall and its antennae were as long as the body of a grown human, but the most terrifying thing was undoubtedly its powerful legs that with every step they took left small cracks in the ground and whose destructive power was more than enough to tear a military vehicle into pieces. The weaver ant and Bai Zemin froze at the same time and used their eyes to measure each other for a second, as somehow neither of them expected to see the other party in this place. But the weaver ant was the first to come out of its daze when it saw more humans suddenly appearing around the corner. The creature that was actually a first-order scout soldier immediately opened its mouth wide, preparing to let out a furious shriek with the intention of alerting the nest of the enemy invasion. Bai Zemin's expression changed slightly as soon as he noticed the weaver ant's intention, and without even a second thought he dashed forward. His body exploded with over 1,000 points of agility, and like a shadow appearing and disappearing he closed almost 100 meters distance in an instant. The weaver ant was about to fulfill its purpose when it suddenly felt as if 2 huge and frighteningly powerful hooks were forcing its mouth shut. By the time its eyes cleared, the creature saw the human from before disappearing and appearing right in front of it and forcing its mouth to close. The scout soldier, despite being a first-order existence without its intelligence fully developed, its instincts were at their peak. Therefore, after realizing that it would not be able to squeal, it immediately began to move its antennae to communicate with its comrades with the intention of passing on the information. Swoosh! Swoosh! It was right at that moment when 2 arrows of burning red fire illuminated the passageway, and before the weaver ant's antennae moved more than an inch, they were turned into scattered ashes after being hit by both elemental arrows. Bai Zemin let out a small sigh of relief and without hesitation hit the weaver ant on the head hard enough for its body to collapse unconscious on the ground. The weaver ant's body fell to the ground and a small bloody wound appeared above its head, but it was clearly alive. Bai Zemin turned just in time to see Feng Tianwu putting down her right hand, indicative that she had just activated a magical skill. "Good job. For a second I forgot about the antennae." He nodded toward her. "It's nothing." Feng Tianwu nodded as well. Bai Zemin did not linger and immediately looked at Little Snow, who was looking at the weaver ant with shining eyes. The big white dog was restless and her eyes darted back and forth between the mutant ant and Xietain at the same time as her drool dripped like a waterfall from her mouth. Seeing the white mutant dog that he had picked up from the street years ago looking at him as if asking for forgiveness, Xietain couldn't help but chuckle and nod. Little Snow immediately put all hesitation aside and turned into a white shadow, dashing forward at full speed as if she could not wait for a second longer. In an instant, the weaver ant's blood dyed the ground green, but it was quickly stored by Xietain in the liquid storage pearl. The eyes of Little Snow sparkled with excitement after claiming the life of the First Order existence and used her head to rub against Xietain as if she was thanking him in the only way she knew how. Although Little Snow was a level 25 mutant beast and had not yet broken into the First Order, the defense of the weaver ants was among the lowest of all mutant creatures and was as weak as that of a normal human, so the claws and teeth of the big white dog were more than enough to take care of one of them that had already been reduced by Xietain. Actually, Xietain had been paying attention to Little Snow for all these days, from the moment she reached level 25 when they were in the forest. While he wasn't 100% sure of his theory, Xietain believed that Little Snow probably needed to hunt down a certain number of First Order existences since he had caught her secretly watching with a certain desire and hunger specifically for First Order soul evolvers and other mutant creatures of the same power scale. Therefore, he had decided to test his theory and in the process, help make the soul power of Little Snow as pure as possible before she officially stepped onto the path of evolution. With the appearance of the first weaver ant, a First Order soldier, the group was now sure that they at least seemed to be walking in the right direction even though it was actually the only visible path. At the same time, each and every one of them had a new level of respect for Xietain, who managed to identify the enemy they faced this time with masterful precision. After making sure that the weaver ant had no soul stone in its head, Xietain drained all the blood from its body and ripped off its legs as they were good material for forging new equipment intended for attack. "Let's get moving," he ordered and immediately took the lead again. "Let's pick up the pace a bit." Little Snow, excited, stopped eating the weaver ant's flesh and ran off after him. She seemed eager and started acting all flirtatious and innocent as if she wanted to get his favor all for the sake of having a chance to devour another good quality prey. Xietain knew that after the first run-in of his group with a weaver ant it would only be a matter of time before the whole colony would know of their arrival, so this time he was moving at a speed of 60 km per hour as that was the speed at which everyone present could keep up with him without using up too much stamina. After several turns and circles, entering and exiting into new passages, Xietain had knocked out more than 20 First Order weaver ants. Each and every one of them was handed over to Little Snow and Meng-Chi. Moreover, his group was not idle either, as there were more than a few occasions when they met First Order soldier rank weaver ants leading small squads of 100 or so unclassified worker and scout ants. Approximately 30 minutes later, Xietain stopped in front of what appeared to be a lugubrious-looking stone room. The room had no door, it was more like an extension of the cave as it was built into the wall. He noticed large amounts of excrement and white bones belonging to other mutated creatures, even a few human bones in there, including small, fragile bones clearly belonging to children. "These damn ants." Huang Tian gritted his teeth and his whole body trembled as he said with anger, "They don't even spare children. This is the difference between them and us after all." All of those present were soul evolvers who had gone through certain tests and examinations before Wu Keqian accepted them into his power regime in the Chinese Renaissance faction. Therefore, while they were not saints, at least each and every one of them had a certain line that they never crossed nor did they plan to cross. Then, seeing the bones of children there, the collective anger naturally began to grow. Xietain surveyed the surroundings of the room silently, noticing that apart from the excrement and bones there were also pieces of torn cloth and dirty shoes. "Let's go on," he said after standing up. They all followed him in silence. Most of them slowly could not help but notice that the person leading them was clearly angry even though his expression was indifferent and indecipherable. But how could they not notice it? Xietain almost completely changed his ways compared to the moment he entered the nest. He went from playing it safe and defensive to becoming the wolf that sneaks out to hunt its prey during the night. And, of course, those who followed him became the pack of wolves that gladly and happily devoured anything that crossed their paths. Arriving at a crossroads with 3 different paths, Xietain did not even hesitate when he ordered in a deep voice, "Bing Shui, you go with Liang Jing and Kai Jingyi to the right side. Qin He, Sun Ling, and Wei Juan, the 3 of you will lead another team on the left path. Except for Feng Tianwu, Nangong Lingxin, Meng-Chi, Little Snow, and Xing Yun, the rest of you divide into 2 and follow the orders of the 6 people I named at the beginning." Xietain took a step forward and said in a clear voice, "Team leader, only the 5 of us will be advancing together with you along the middle path?" "That is correct," Xietain said and asked, "Any problem?" Xietain chuckled and shook his head, "No, actually I'm eager to try." Xietain smiled slightly and said in a serious voice, "Everyone, we will meet in this place in 30 minutes. If something bad happens somewhere, any of you can launch a powerful attack against the wall to call for help and I will be there as soon as possible." After making sure everyone understood his words, Xietain took the 3 evolved women, the evolved man, and the white mutant dog down the middle path. As they advanced down the middle path, Mengqi looked over her shoulder and could not help but frown when she saw Feng Tianwu following them from behind. She approached Xietain and whispered softly, "Big brother, why did you bring this woman? You could have chosen anyone else after all." Xietain was surprised for a moment before smiling bitterly in his heart. Although Mengqi was speaking softly, the levels of Nangong Lingxin, Feng Tianwu, and Xietain were much higher than their current level 29, so they were naturally able to hear her words loud and clear. In fact, looking over his shoulder for a moment, it was not hard for Xietain to notice how Feng Tianwu's expression changed for a moment before she recovered her usual stoic expression. On the other hand, Xietain and Nangong Lingxin looked at Feng Tianwu with surprise. The 2 of them could not help but wonder what kind of history there was between Xietain and his sister with the beautiful and powerful fire mage of the Feng family, since they apparently knew each other from before and the memories did not seem to be pleasant. Xietain continued to move forward, and as he looked straight ahead, he said in a clear voice for all to hear and understand his thoughts, "Nangong Lingxin possesses defensive and offensive skills capable of blocking and returning enemy attacks of great power. Xietain is a mage with outstanding crowd control skills, and lastly, the magic attack power and fire skills of Feng Tianwu are excellent for taking out large numbers of enemies at the same time. That's why I brought you all with me, since you all in your own way can play a great role without getting in my way." Hearing his words, a flash of weird light shone in the eyes of Feng Tianwu. At the same time, she could not help but feel more bitter than anything else after hearing Xietain praise her openly and without any prejudice in his voice. The more indifferent Xietain acted as if he really had nothing against her and as if he did not know her at all, treating her as he treated any other soul evolver, the more Feng Tianwu felt uncomfortable in her chest. Be that as it may, Mengqi also understood her big brother's thoughts upon hearing his explanation. Mengqi couldn't help but blush a little as she realized that perhaps she was the only one who still kept the past present, so she quickly decided to change the subject a little bit. "Big brother, what about me then? You've said the good point of the 3 of them, but not mine." Mengqi puffed out her cheeks in an adorable pout and acting like a younger sister wanting to be pampered. Xietain didn't know whether to laugh or cry seeing the usually mature Mengqi acting like this. He ruffled her silky hair a bit and said with a faint smile, "If any magic circle appears, the only person I can trust is naturally you. This is a field where even I can't step into." Hee hee. Mengqi immediately felt a little pleased with herself and smiled happily as she nodded. "Woof. Xietain turned to his left and said in confusion, "Little Snow, what's wrong?" "Woof." Little Snow looked at him with her bright blue eyes wide open and even put out her tongue cheerfully as if she was waiting for something. Xietain looked at the big white dog in confusion. Nangong Lingxin could barely contain the urge to laugh and said in a choked voice, "Team leader, you might want to praise your pet a little?" Xietain immediately realized what was going on after listening to Nangong Lingxin and seeing Little Snow's bright eyes. He couldn't force a smile on his face. Of course, our Little Snow is very skillful at hunting those mutant ants, moving as fast as lightning. She'll definitely be of great help since she's about to evolve. Woof. Woof. The big white dog barked twice low enough not to alert anyone and her eyes shone brightly, clearly satisfied with what she was hearing. This time, Nangong Lingxin really couldn't hold back the urge to laugh and had to cover her mouth so as not to make too much noise. But she was not the only one, as Xietain and Mengqi were the same, and even Feng Tianwu had a trace of an amused smile on her face. Xietain shook his head and continued to lead the small group. On the way, they ran into more weaver ants compared to the past. In just 5 minutes, and while occasionally exchanging a few words with each other, they had already hunted down more than 300 weaver ants, among which there were 5 soldiers. It seemed that little by little they were approaching the core of the ant colony. Chapter 678, The Awakening of the Queen. Another 5 minutes passed when the group of 4 humans and 1 mutant beast led by Xietain suddenly found a wide open space before them. However, none of them had time to stop to appreciate what kind of place this was, and the only thing they really had time to appreciate was that before they were enemies in large numbers and that it was also a damp place. A particular weaver ant caught Xietan's attention, this ant was clearly different from the first-order soldier weaver ants and unclassified workers. Its body, covered in a kind of dark red skin, was about 5 feet tall, the glint in its black eyes clearly showed the creature's intelligence, and the 2 sickles protruding from the sides of its mouth were especially gloomy, moving in a continuous opening and closing motion. When the red ant saw Xietain and his group, instead of behaving like all the other weaver ants and trying to alert the entire colony using the group link they all shared with the queen, what it did was to rush forward. Second order? Humph. Xietain snorted as he saw the red shadow charging toward him with a movement speed of at least 300 points of agility. In the eyes of Xietain, who altogether with the treasures he had in his body possessed over 1,000 points of agility, the second-order weaver ant was moving as slow as a snail. He even had time to activate blood manipulation and prevent the other weaver ants from alerting the colony at the same time as he shouted a simple but concise order. Kill all these goddamn ants. But Xietan's order was not necessary. He was not the only one who was furious with the weaver ants after finding the tiny bones belonging to infant lives. The first to move was Feng Tianwu, who after Xietain had the highest level, being currently a level 49 soul evolver on the verge of level 50 in getting her breakthrough quest. She stomped hard on the ground she stood on, and with her amber eyes focused on a group of over 10 first-order weaver ants she called out in a confident and powerful voice. Chains of Agni! Bang! 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 In response to Feng Tianwu's call, 100 chains broke from the ground like subway monsters. The chains were bright red in color and their temperature was so high that all the dampness in the place began to be swept away as soon as they made their appearance. It was not difficult to notice that at the sudden appearance of the burning flames all the weaver ants became anxious, as even the red ant charging toward Xietain stopped for a moment before continuing its advance after identifying him as the most dangerous person among the human group. Xietain did not immediately strike with his great sword and instead clenched his left fist. At the same time as he took a small step forward and punched using 70% of his total strength, he imagined gloves similar to a dragon's claws, and just as a golden flash gleamed on his hands his attack met head-on with the red-colored weaver ant's attack. Boom! Xietan's fist, covered by a majestic-looking golden glove that he had transformed annihilation of the falling sky into, easily blocked the onslaught of the second-order weaver ant, and after a powerful explosion, the creature's body was sent flying backward. Boom! The red-colored weaver ant destroyed several ball-like objects half a meter high and at least a meter in diameter after being sent flying by Xietan's punch before slamming hard into the stone wall, hidden behind what appeared to be a huge white spider web. Damn, are all these stuff eggs? Xietain cursed as he looked at the not yet fully developed larvae that after losing the warmth of the eggs died on the spot. The room was at least 500 meters long and about 1,000 meters high, but it was almost completely filled with those balls and spider webs. It was then that Xietain remembered the reason why the weaver ant was called the weaver ant. Ha 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 ha. All right. Xietain laughed heartily and while pointing to the ceiling said with anger in his voice, since you slaughter the children of my human race, then I guess no one can complain if I do the same, right? Surprisingly, the red-colored weaver ant had not died after taking Xietan's attack, and except for a crack in the sickle on the right side of its mouth, it seemed to be fine. When the red ant managed to crawl out of the wall where its body had been buried and saw the blue flame dancing on top of Xietan's golden dragon claw-like glove, its black eyes trembled and as if realizing something it tried to open its mouth and move its antennae to communicate with the rest of the colony, but to its horror, it found that it was not possible. The red ant had lost certain abilities after Xietain cunningly snuck his mana inside its body and with the use of blood manipulation prevented it from being able to move its antennae to send messages or open its mouth to screech. Burn! The words of Xietain had just rang out when the endless lotus blue flame flew from his palm and after hovering 500 meters above the ground it began to glow brightly. Swoosh! 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 Hundreds and then thousands of bright blue fire arrows shot out from the blue fireball floating in the air, and those fire arrows indiscriminately hit the webs covering the larvae eggs, as well as the eggs themselves. The bodies of the baby ants that were still in the process of development exploded and turned into a pile of mortal remains as they were engulfed by the blue flames that kept spreading throughout the room, living up to its name as an endless flame. Bang! 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 Such a beautiful fire. Feng Tianwu whispered with dreamy eyes as her pupils reflected the blue flames. She was surrounded by chains of bright red fire and seemed to be quite adept at using them, as she had currently already finished off the 10 first-order weaver ants with the help of Xietain and was currently about to help Meng Qi, Nangong and Little Snow, but she couldn't help but pause to see what was going on as the room was dyed blue. The endless lotus blue flame was one of the most eye-catching and beautiful flames of all due to its color and brightness, so it was only natural for Feng Tianwu to be dazed at the sight of it, considering that her class was fire worshipper. Meng Qi, who under the protection of Nangong and with Little Snow's help was wreaking havoc among the 5,000 unclassified weaver ants, paused as well. She had not wanted to lose to Feng Tianwu despite knowing that in terms of ability she was currently unable to match her, so Meng Qi had made use of some runes she had managed to learn and which had taken her almost 2 whole days to draw on her combat boots and armor to boost her physical ability and defense to the point of matching a soul evolver almost 10 levels above her. But like Feng Tianwu, she was amazed as this was the first time she had seen her brother's flame. "What's wrong, insect? Can't you call your friends?" Xietain sneered at the red ant, who was looking at him with eyes filled with murderous intent. Xietain began to walk toward the red ant, his eyes blazing with the same anger and murderous intent that the creature had. He knew that as a second-order existence the red-colored weaver ant could definitely understand his intention even if it was unable to understand his words. "Come, it's not like you can't move your body, or is it?" Indeed, the red weaver ant could understand the intention behind the words of Xietain and also understood that he was mocking it by seeing the smile that was filled with disdain on his face. Therefore, with flames of anger burning in its eyes, the second-order ant charged forward with the intention of tearing him into a million pieces. This time, Xietain did not hold back at all, and with a fierce swing of his left arm, his golden dragon claw-covered fist smashed head-on into the red-colored weaver ant's left sickle. Boom! Just like the previous time, the red ant's body was sent flying like a kite whose string had been cut, and its figure soon disappeared beyond the blue sea of fire that was quickly devouring the entire room and annihilating the larvae. That thing didn't die? However, far from feeling happy, Xietain had an ashen expression on his face. This was because while he had not activated any skills, his seemingly casual punch was loaded with over 900 strength points and also carried the 1000 physical attack points from annihilation of the falling sky. Any other second-order existence would definitely have been turned into a pile of pulp, not to mention the red-colored weaver ants, since Xietain could feel that it wasn't even level 80. Damn, these things have too much strength after all. Xietain gritted his teeth, and this time he didn't wait for the weaver ant to charge toward him, but instead, he dashed to the fire-blue sea and disappeared beyond the flames. The weaver ants were among the strongest creatures that existed on the face of the earth, technically speaking, since the most powerful ones could lift up to 100 times their body. It was just that because in the past they were small that power was insignificant in the eyes of other bigger creatures. But now that they had evolved, the natural strength of a weaver ant was definitely frightening, let alone a second-order weaver ant. Because Xietain was the current master of the endless lotus blue flame, the blue flames naturally could not harm him, and he could see into the sea of fire as if he had special eyes, so he actually had no trouble at all finding the red-colored ant that was writhing in pain, as it ran in his direction even though its eyes had been incinerated by the fire. Although the red ant could not use its antennae to communicate, it could at least use them to detect enemies. Xietain rushed forward with the intention of trying the limits of the second-order weaver ants to know how to deal with them in the future, as there would definitely be more soon, and the one in front of him was but one of many. He hit the weaver ant again and sent it flying backward, but this time he didn't wait, and making use of his agility more than 3 times as high, he followed the creature's flight course. The weaver ant had not even managed to stand up when it instinctively blocked Xietan's golden fist, and its body was buried in the ground after a powerful quake shook the room. Xietain raised his right hand clenched into a fist, and without giving the second-order ant time to recover, he struck downward ferociously with a gaze that was filled with murderous intent. Boom! Without the protection of the 2 sickles blocking his fists, the red-colored weaver ant's head exploded like a watermelon, falling from the 10th floor of a building with pieces of brain matter, flesh, and blood flying everywhere. Fortunately, Xietan's body, as well as the surroundings, were engulfed in flames, so he was not affected by the corrosive blood of the dead beast. You have obtained the soul power of second-order powerful ant weaver level 74. You cannot absorb the obtained soul power or receive additional stats before completing your class advancement quest. Xietain ignored the green message flashing in his retina and instead looked at the corpse of the second-order weaver ant with surprise. Even though my fist hit this thing's head, the strength I used should have turned its entire body into a pile of bloody mist. Xietain muttered in shock. Did the second-order weaver ants have such a high defense? If that was the case, then this mission could be way more difficult and dangerous than he initially figured it would be. Xietain was completely confident that if given some time he would be able to annihilate even a few thousand red ants, but he was not 100% confident in protecting the people behind him if within the ant colony, there were more than 200 ants and they were all attacking at the same time. More important, Xietain was surprised to find out that if a third-order weaver ant appeared, purely based on the power of the red-colored weaver ant he had just killed, he might have to bring out several of his trump cards or he could end up in trouble. At the very least, Xietain was sure that the endless blue lotus flame would be crucial in this raid. I'd better hurry. Xietain frowned and began to worry about the other two teams. The thought that splitting up was a bad idea began to grow within his heart even though each of the other two teams was being composed of powerful existences like Shangguan Bingshui who was capable of fighting against an initial third-order existence or like Qinhe and Xia. Xietain cut off the two red-colored ant sickles as they were clearly good material for forging weapons and also took the soul stone that had fallen a short distance away after he exploded the creature's head. When he emerged from the sea of blue flames a minute later, the battle was already ended. With Feng Tianwu and Xingyun leading the attack and with Meng Qi, Nan Gonglingxin, and Little Snow acting as support, all the weaver ants were annihilated in no time. Feng Tianwu looked especially eye-catching with the huge, thick chains of deep red fire dancing around her as if they were worshipping her. Big brother. Meng Qi sighed in relief as she saw the silhouette of a person becoming clearer and clearer amidst the sea of blue fire. Moments later, the figure of Xietain emerged from the fire. Team leader, is that red ant a second-order existence? Xingyun asked with an excited smile. This had been by far his most satisfying battle to date. Having powerful teammates really made everything easier and he could make use of his mask control skills perfectly. It was. Xietain waved his left hand still surrounded by the golden dragon claw and in response the sea of blue fire shook, flying toward the small ball of deep blue fire that silently hovered 500 meters above. That red ant was really powerful. Hearing Xietan's words, everyone subconsciously looked at the now visible headless corpse and couldn't help but think that the red ant didn't seem to be that strong considering it was sent flying at every crash and defeated in less than 2 minutes. But in fact, they did not know that Xietain was not joking. The red-colored weaver ant had really alerted him. Xietain took a last look around the room and saw that everything had been turned to ashes. He with the help of his team quickly collected all the soul stones and was about to walk toward the exit of the room when his footsteps stopped abruptly and he quickly turned to face the side wall as if he wanted to see beyond. Screech! It was then that a high-pitched, thunderous screech that did not sound like the sound of a living thing echoed from the depths of the colony, resounding with anger and anguish as if it had just lost something important. The face of Meng Qi turned white and she subconsciously moved closer to Xietain. Even Feng Tianwu and Xingyun's expressions turned ugly. Was that the queen? Nan Gonglingxin said with a serious voice and a frown. Xietain narrowed his eyes before turning around and ordering in a deep voice, "Let's get moving." The surprise element was no longer on their side. This was now going to be a two-way war. Chapter 679 Humans vs. Weaver Ants, Fierce and Deadly Battle, Part 1. Although Xietain was worried about the rest of the team, he did not immediately leave the central passage through which he had entered in the company of 4 soul evolvers and a mutant beast. To begin with, none of the teams had sent a signal asking for help, and as if that was not enough, there was also an even more important factor that Xietain could not discard, and it was that if he had come into the most dangerous passage and leave it to go and help one of the teams, then what he would be doing would be to let the strongest weaver ants free to do whatever they wanted to do. No matter how one put it, Xietain was only one person regardless of how strong he might be. Xietain had no way of splitting his body in two to help the two teams at the same time since in this kind of situation even sending a clone of him using the skill lightning movement the uses would be quite null considering that in front of the red-colored weaver ants a clone would be shattered in a matter of seconds. Therefore, after leaving the previous room in which at least several million closing larvae were killed by Xietan's endless blue lotus flame, what he did was to lead his team of 5 deeper into the central passage. Big brother, more weaver ants. Meng Qi pointed to the front where a huge number of green dots were approaching at full speed raising a cloud of dust behind them. I've got it covered. Xietain calmly replied as he pointed ahead. Burn! Bang! A whirlwind of blue flames shot forward from the middle of his palm and in an instant covered the 100-meter width of the passageway. Surprisingly, however, the temperature of the place did not seem to have risen at all. The firestorm of blue fire exploded with great power and when the flames were reflected in the large eyes of the army of weaver ants they did not even have time to comprehend what was happening as their bodies were engulfed by the blue flames. The torrent of deep blue fire spread along the entire length and breadth of the passage, extending more than 5 kilometers and incinerating everything that crossed its path. The bodies of the green-colored weaver ants exploded as soon as they came into contact with the flames of Xietain and turned into a pile of mortal remnants. Even the first-order weaver ants were not spared. Approximately 5 seconds later, all that remained on the ground were several piles of soul stones glowing amidst the gloomy atmosphere of the cave. Amazing! Xietain sighed in admiration as he looked at the massacre Xietain had just carried out with a seemingly simple attack. What skill is that? Feng Tianwu couldn't help but ask due to the shock she felt. What Xietain had just slaughtered was not a few tens of weaver ants, it was at least 20,000 of them. 20,000 enemies in less than 10 seconds. This skill is called Endless Blue Lotus Flame. Xietain replied without saying anything else. He would not tell anyone he did not completely trust that his blue flames did not come from a skill but were the product of a natural treasure that in the past had been one of the few divine flames in the universe. Although Xietain had just annihilated a large number of weaver ants, he did not order his team to stop gathering the soul stones because time was crucial at this moment. Besides, when this battle against the weaver ants ended, everything inside this huge cave would be theirs and the soul stones would certainly not be walking anywhere. 20 minutes passed and during that time the group led by Xietain found a total of 5 more rooms and all of them were filled with weaver ant larvae eggs. In addition, in those 5 rooms, there were also red ants guarding the developing larvae. However, no matter how strong the second-order weaver ants might be, in the face of Xietan's overwhelming power, they were nothing. Therefore, the 5 rooms became the burial place for a few 100,000 weaver ants along with millions and millions of larvae. During that period of time, Feng Tianwu reached level 50 and she had currently become a truly formidable existence on the verge of evolution. As for Nangong Lingxin, she had reached level 48 and was second only to Feng Tianwu if Xietain was left out of the equation. Xietain was in third place and was currently level 47, only one level below Nangong Lingxin. Meng Qi had managed to reach level 34 and Little Snow was still in the process of evolving, so considering the large amount of soul power she had been accumulating so far, she would definitely jump at the very least to the level of Meng Qi when she completed her first order requirements. Let's go all the way back. Xietain ordered as he realized that the time limit for returning to meet the rest was approaching. None of his team said a word and instead of wasting time, they quickly followed him. Although they had not gone all the way through the passage, they had all agreed to meet again at the place where the path diverged into 3 branches so that it was impossible to continue unless they wanted the others to think that something bad had happened, which could have serious consequences. The way back was naturally a lot smoother. After all the weaver ants had been eliminated. Xietain and the other members of his team realized that apparently the entire colony was connected by several paths, but they probably all led to a single direction at the end, or otherwise, more weaver ants would be waiting for them in the rear. Looks like Qinhe and Bingshue's team are doing well. Xietain sighed in relief. So far there had been no sign of help and there were also no weaver ants that had sneaked in from the other passages, so at least it was a good sign. However, Xietain spoke too soon as just as they were halfway back a thunderous explosion seemed to shake the entire cave. Boom! It's the group of Wuyijuan and the rest. Nangong Lingxin cried out in worry. Xietain had put Wuyijuan, Sun Ling, and Qinhe on the same team since leaving aside Shangguan Bingxue they were among the most powerful people in the entire human team. Moreover, he was sure that Shangguan Bingxue had also sent Xiaya with the other team since other than herself Xiaya was the only second-order existence capable of holding another second-order existence and even helping in times of need thanks to her class. Xietan's expression changed. He said nothing and with a single thought, the liquid storage pearl came out of his pocket. Ah! What is this? Xietain ignored the screams behind him and after activating blood manipulation to create several giant red hands to grab each of his team members he shouted out loud, "All of you, hold on tight and close your mouths so that you don't bite your tongues." Feng Tianwu opened her mouth to ask what was going on but suddenly her vision went blurry. The explosive forward movement caused her mouth to close abruptly and as a result, she ended up biting her tongue. Tears of injustice filled her eyes but she wisely did not try to say anything else this time and obediently did what Xietain told them to do. With over 1,000 points of agility, Xietan's movement speed was just monstrous. His body was like a ghost that appeared and disappeared, as if he was teleporting as every time his figure became clear it was every 100 meters but that figure only lasted for an instant before being replaced by a new one 100 meters ahead. About a minute before Xietain sped up with no intention of wasting time after receiving the signal for help, a really bloody battle was going on in the passage on the left side. Humans and weaver ants were facing each other with bloodshot eyes. In the eyes of each one of them, the only thing that was reflected was the figure of the enemy in front of them and none of the two sides seemed to have the intention of retreating at all. Bang! Bang! Bang, 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 bang. Chinhee's body flickered in the middle of the battlefield, his silhouette coming and going amidst the seemingly endless sea of weaver ants. His right hand became a blur and the blue string of his magic-grade treasure bow constantly rumbled, firing over 200 arrows per second, which meant the death of at least twice as many enemies as the power of each of the mana arrows was big enough to pierce through several ants. Damn it. These fucking ants just won't stop coming no matter how many I kill. But Chinhee was by no means happy and in fact, looked anxious. Even though he had killed over 200,000 weaver ants by himself, the number did not seem to drop at all, and on the contrary, each time the human group looked more and more overwhelmed. In fact, were it not for Chinhee himself, who with his arrows took out hundreds of enemies per second, Wuijuan, who with her seeds had raised her own mutant forest that served to hold back and had already destroyed tens of thousands of enemies, Sunling, who with her agile movements and charm that confused the enemy, Fenghong with his fierce flames that had incinerated over 150,000 enemies, and Huang Tian, who single-handedly saved the lives of almost all of the group's mages and archers at least a dozen times, the entire group would have been destroyed by this time. But, there was one person who carried the hope of everyone present. Chinhee looked toward the battlefield slightly away from the rest, where two existences were engaged in combat several times more deadly compared to the battle the rest were experiencing. A red shadow and a dark-colored shadow were flickering, one chasing and destroying the surroundings with its powerful physical strength, while the other nimbly and skillfully dodged the red shadow's attacks while casting several curses on the enemy. The red silhouette was naturally a second-order weaver ant. As for the dark silhouette, it was none other than Xietain. Although the red ant's agility was nothing in the eyes of a monster like Baizemin, this did not mean that to Xietain it was not. In fact, at the beginning of the fight, had it not been for Wuijuan acting in consequence, Xietain might have been cut into two pieces by the sickles of the red ant that was cunningly hiding among the endless sea of weaver ants. Fortunately, however, Xietain seemed to be able to fight as an equal against the red ant, even though the red ant was actually of a higher level. This was partially because, taking advantage of the opportunity Wuijuan had granted her at the beginning of the fight, she cast a curse called Limited Agility that for 10 minutes erased 20% of the agility points from the enemy's system. However, even though Xietain could currently hold her ground, a simple mistake would mean being caught by the red ant and her weak body would be torn apart even before she could scream in pain. During this battle, even though the humans numbered only a little over 50 and their enemies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, none of them looked scared. In fact, they all seemed furious. The humans' fury came from the 15 human corpses that even in the midst of the battle were being devoured by the weaver ants. It was the first time the expedition group had fought without Baizemin at the head, and these were the consequences that could soon worsen. Chinhee frowned and, after hesitating for a brief second, decided to send out the signal for help. However, it was then that he caught sight of another red shadow charging from the distance, and his pupils contracted to the smallest possible extent. Chapter 680, Humans vs. Weaver Ants, Fierce and Deadly Battle, Part 2. Shit. Alarm bells rang in Chinhee's head as he saw the red shadow charging up from the bottom of the sea of green ants, and immediately shouted out loud, "Xietain, watch out." All the hairs on Xiaoya's body stood on end, just like a cat instinctively sensing danger as Chinhee's warning rumbled inside the passageway. She didn't even hesitate and immediately chanted one of her skills that allowed her to improve her system, Shared Agility. Sunling, who was facing dozens of weaver ants at the same time, immediately felt a kind of connection between her stat system with someone else's. Moreover, even though she instinctively tried to block that connection, she was surprised to realize that she actually could not do so. It was then that she remembered Xietain and calmed down. As for Xietain, she immediately felt her body becoming lighter and everything around her began to move slower, a product of her explosive increase in speed. But Xietain did not have time to appreciate the changes as she was immediately forced to move, because from her back, she felt a breeze of cold air prickling her neck. Xietain jumped to the side, taking advantage of her agility, which temporarily, but by a wide margin, surpassed the red-colored weaver ant she was facing, easily dodging the vicious sickles of the creature, which if successful, would have cut her body into two halves. At the same time, her movement prevented her head from flying through the air, as an instant later the second red-colored ant appeared just above where Xietain was standing a second ago. Cursed hands. Xietain waved her magic wand, which was actually a magic-grade treasure just like Chinhee's bow, and at the same time as she chanted, several black-colored hands came out from the shadows of the red-colored weaver ants. The two red-colored ants had no time to do anything when the black hands touched their bodies, but surprisingly, the black hands disappeared as soon as they touched their bodies, so the second-order weaver ants thought that the enemy attack had failed. But just as the two red ants were about to charge forward, they both felt all their stats plummet to the point where they had become at least 20% weaker overall. A 20% decrease in the overall strength of a second-order existence was no small feat. Not to mention the fact that Xietain had just taken 20% of the total strength of two second-order existences. In a battle between two existences of the same order of power, a single stat point could become crucial, not to mention 20% of the entire power system. Xietain gritted her teeth and after a moment of hesitation rushed forward, entangling herself in combat again, but this time against two second-order enemies. Even if both red-colored weaver ants were now weaker and she was faster, the number of enemies had doubled, so the danger Xietain faced had also increased. It was just that Xietain could not ask anyone for help and could only rely on herself this time. This was because if Xinhe or any other crucial soul evolver abandoned their current task to fight one of the red-colored weaver ants, the result would be that hundreds of thousands of unclassified weaver ants and at least several tens of First Order would be free to wreak havoc among the human group that was barely managing to survive. Damn! Xinhe gritted his teeth as he understood the thoughts of Xietain. After a moment's consideration, a flash of determination shone in his eyes. I have no choice. He leaped several hundred meters into the air, moving away from the battlefields for a moment, and immediately pulled his bowstring back to the maximum. Xinhe directly channeled 50% of his mana and activated the most powerful skill he currently had in his arsenal. Xietain, move back quickly. Xietain looked up for a moment and her pupils contracted as she saw the silhouette of a white bow behind Xinhe, as well as an arrow at least 5 meters long and 1 meter wide glowing amidst the darkness. She didn't even think twice as she cast a binding curse on the two red ants and quickly retreated without looking back. Xinhe gritted his teeth and with a pale face shouted, "Sacred arrow." Bang! He released the arrow from his bow and at the same time, the image behind him responded in sync. The air exploded as the huge white arrow broke the sound barrier, and before the two red ants could react, they were hit head-on by the white arrow. Boom! A thunderous explosion shook the cave at the same time as a huge cloud of dust rose everywhere blocking everyone's view. At least 150,000 weaver ants were shattered on the spot after being hit by the violent shockwave resulting from the explosion. Xietain, who had retreated nearly 1,000 meters in a matter of seconds, looked back with a pale face and could not help but tremble at the thought of being hit by such an attack. Worst of all, if not for Xinhe's attack being focused to the opposite side, she would definitely have been hit by the shockwave. Xinhe landed on the ground again, right next to Xietain. "Are you okay?" Xietain asked with a frown as she saw Xinhe's pale face. He was panting heavily and with great difficulty said slowly, "That attack drains 80% of my stamina and half of my mana. I can't fight for much longer." Seeing the expression on Xiaoya's face turned ugly, he smiled wearily and said in a low voice, "At least, my goal was accomplished. In several ways." The dust cloud soon settled down due to the constant explosions from the surroundings, and when Xietain could see the center of the impact point, she finally understood the reason why Xinhe said such words. A crater at least 500 meters in diameter appeared where Xietain had been fighting the red-colored weaver ants, and a large part of the wall had collapsed as a result of the powerful explosion. However, what caught the attention of Xietain the most was the red head of an ant lying on the brink of the crater with blood oozing out of its severed neck. "Did you kill one?" Xietain looked at Xinhe in shock and disbelief. Hee. Xinhe laughed softly with several beads of sweat falling down his face but still proud. "That's my strongest attack. Even a mid-ranked second-order existence won't come out unscathed, let alone that level 54 ant." Xietain nodded and without saying anything she dashed forward, just in time as the second red-colored weaver ant emerged from the crater. But it was clear that despite having survived as it was not Xinhe's focal target, this second-order weaver ant had suffered quite a bit due to the explosion, as its movements were not only not as agile as before, but there were several bloody cracks all over its body. Xinhe sighed in relief as he saw Xietain immediately take the upper hand as soon as she started fighting the red-colored weaver ant. But looking at the surroundings, he frowned again. Even though one of the red-colored weaver ants had just been killed by his surprise attack and the other had been injured to the point that Xietain would have no trouble killing it within the next few minutes, the situation was still very bad. The total number of weaver ants, far from decreasing, was increasing. No matter how many the humans killed, the weaver ants continued to appear, and at this point, the group had been surrounded, leaving no escape. Every living being had a stamina limit except the zombie race during the unclassified stage, therefore, all living beings would definitely succumb to exhaustion at some point. The question was who could outlast the other. At this rate we'll all be swallowed up by these damn ants. He took a deep breath before charging forward and starting to fight again despite his legs trembling due to the sudden huge stamina consumption. He's killing speed had naturally dropped, but he was still a bit relieved that his previous attack also served another purpose besides killing one of the red weaver ants. To alert Xietain and call for help. That person should be here in a minute considering his monstrous agility. He sighed in relief as he lamented over the casualties the human group had experienced. Xietain had led the human group for days, from the forest to the ruins and even fought against a fourth-order existence. However, during all that time, Xietain had lost only a dozen men, and this only happened during the first ruin because the power and surprise attack of the electromagnetic rifles was something no one expected. On the other hand, he had led a smaller team, so, in theory, it should be easier to avoid casualties. However, in just half an hour, he and his team had already suffered more than 16 casualties at this point. At what point did the difference between him and me become that big? He could not help but wonder aloud, in a voice that only he and the weaver ants beside him heard. Xietain had been risking his life from the beginning, and he respected him greatly and even admired him. However, he also felt a bit bitter. Hadn't he risked his life too? He had suffered serious injuries on several occasions and had sacrificed hours of sleep for the sake of finding prey with a higher level than him for the sake of purifying his soul power. However, far from closing the gap, Xietain simply seemed to be a reincarnated divine god with an easier path open to him from his past life. No matter what he did, it did not seem to be possible to ever reach him. In reality, he had done an excellent job leading the troops. The problem was that the number of enemies was simply too large, and there were even second-order existences among them. In fact, he had done a commendable performance, it was just that he was not even a little bit satisfied with the result. However, he made a big mistake for the first time. He got distracted. In the middle of an extremely dangerous battlefield like this. Swoosh! He suddenly felt a piercing breeze of wind blow past him, and his pupils trembled fiercely as he realized what had just happened. He abruptly turned around and his whole body trembled in terror as cold sweat covered him. A red shadow broke past his obstruction due to his momentary distraction and had now reached the human group. It was a second-order weaver ant. And the first person in the creature's line of sight happened to be Xietain froze when she met the eyes brimming with murderous intent of the red-colored weaver ant that had just appeared in front of her like a ghost. She had been controlling the entire battlefield and even extended a helping hand to Xietain in the distance, using vines to limit for brief moments the movements of the second-order existence she was facing. Therefore, when a second red ant appeared on the backline, even though it shouldn't be there, she naturally didn't know how to react. In front of the beautiful Xietan's black eyes, her figure was reflected in the big eyes of the red ant closer and closer. As if everything had been slowed down to let her appreciate the moment of her death. Xietain saw the sickles of the terrifying ant approaching her neck and the disgusting drool of the beast slipping from its half-open mouth. It was right at that moment when, without her expecting it, her body was sent flying to the side after being struck by someone. Ugh! Xietain looked still stunned at the person who had just saved her life, and her face turned white when she saw and understood what was happening. Huang Tian looked back with a somewhat complicated smile and said softly, "Well, at least we can say that I fulfilled my role as a tank until the end." His chuckle was cut short as his arms were shattered by the sickles of the second-order weaver ant, and a moment later, his head flew off into the air. His headless body remained standing for a second before falling to the side. His blood splattered on the ground, and his armor, covered in dents and broken in several places, was soon covered with his own blood, as well as that of the enemies that were killed in real time. This was the first time an important figure had died on the battlefield, and it had turned out to be none other than one of the leaders of the 4 guilds of the Chinese Renaissance.